There's a funny thing about dreams, real dreams, the kind that dig their roots deep into your guts and whisper promises to you at 3 a.m. We build them up in our heads, brick by brick, blueprint by blueprint, convinced that the thing we're building is the dream. We pour ourselves into it, every spare dime, every drop of sweat, every last bit of hope. And when it crumbles, or when the world just won't let it stand, it feels like it's not just the dream that's buried, but a piece of your very soul right alongside it. You feel hollowed out, empty, like you got nothing left to give. But sometimes burying a thing ain't the end of it at all. Sometimes it's just planting a seed. Sometimes what you thought was the coffin turns out to be the fertile ground. This story, it's about a man named Lester. Lester was 48, though the lines etched around his eyes and across his forehead made him look a few years older, like a piece of oak aged by sun and wind. He was a factory man, had been for as long as anyone could remember, working the same assembly line, smelling the same oils and hot metal every single day. You'd see him clock in just before the 6 a.m. whistle, a quiet silhouette against the gray dawn. He was built solid, not bulky, but with the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of lifting, pushing, steady, repetitive motion. His shoulders had a permanent slight stoop, a testament to years spent hunched over benches, coaxing recalcitrant parts into place. His hands, though, his hands told a deeper story. They were big workers' hands, scarred at the knuckles, calloused thick across the palms. They weren't soft hands, not by a long shot, but if you watched him, you'd see a surprising dexterity, a gentle precision when he handled a delicate piece of machinery, or when he'd pick up a stray bolt from the greasy floor. Those hands had a knowing about them, an intelligence that his quiet demeanor often concealed. Most folks at the plant knew Lester as reliable, solid as a rock, the kind of guy who just got on with it, never complained much. He'd nod a greeting, maybe offer a gruff morning or afternoon, but his eyes often had a distant look, like he was watching a movie playing just behind his eyelids, a movie no one else could see. That quietness, that reliable front, it was a finely crafted shield. Underneath it, Lester carried the weight of something that had broken him, something he'd kept mostly to himself, even from his Martha, though she knew the ghost of it haunted their small, neat home. He had an untapped well of ambition, a creative fire that factory work could never quench, a yearning for something more than just clocking in and clocking out until the day he retired. He wanted to leave something behind, something that wasn't just another bolt in a machine. He wanted a legacy, a mark he could point to and say, "That was me. I made that." That unspoken desire was the quiet hope that hummed beneath his everyday weariness, a hope often overshadowed by a gnawing fear of falling short, of risking everything and ending up with nothing but an empty promise. It was the dream that defined him, even in its absence. It was the dream that defined him, even in its absence. And its absence was a constant, dull ache, a phantom limb that still twitched with memory and longing. Every morning, the 5 a.m. alarm was a fresh reminder. Not a jolt, but a slow, insistent hum that pulled him from the quiet of sleep back into the rhythmic drone of his waking life. Lester would swing his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar chill of the linoleum on his bare feet a small, daily shock. Martha would stir beside him, maybe a soft sigh, but she knew his routine as well as he did. There was no need for words. He'd make his coffee black and strong, the smell filling the small kitchen of their well-maintained but dated house. The house was a monument to their careful living, everything in its place, worn but clean, a quiet testament to two people who knew how to make a dollar stretch. He'd eat his bowl of oatmeal, slowly listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant rumble of the early morning traffic. It was in these quiet moments before the world truly woke that the ghost of the dream was most present. A flash of metal, the smell of cutting oil, the satisfying thrum of a machine precisely doing its work. Then with a sigh, he'd gather his lunch pail, kiss Martha's still sleeping temple, and head out the door. The factory was a beast of steel and noise, an unending symphony of clangs, whistles, and the insistent grind of machinery. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. He was a cog, a good cog, a reliable cog, but a cog nonetheless. He worked the line, fitting parts, inspecting welds, repeating motions he'd mastered years ago, motions that now required little thought, leaving his mind free to wander, often back to where it should. He knew the precise tolerance of every component, the exact torque needed for every bolt, the rhythm of the conveyor belt that carried their output. His body moved with an ingrained efficiency, but his spirit often felt tethered, watching the clock tick down, minute by agonizing minute. The money was steady, if never quite enough. Paycheck to paycheck, a delicate dance with the bills. The mortgage, the utilities, the car insurance, and now the ever-present cost of Sarah's tuition. Their daughter out there in the world making her own way was their pride and joy. But college was a hungry mouth, and Lester felt the constant pressure to keep feeding it, to ensure she had the opportunities he never did. He carried that burden with a quiet stoicism, never complaining, just working harder, sometimes picking up extra shifts, the fatigue etching deeper lines around his eyes. But beneath the surface of the reliable factory worker, beneath the quiet husband and proud father, was a deeper unease, a gnawing question that refused to be silenced. He'd spent years pouring every spare dollar, every waking hour outside of the factory, into Lester's custom fabrication. It wasn't just a shop, it was the physical embodiment of his ambition, the canvas for his untapped creativity. He saw himself as a craftsman, not just a labor unit. The dream had been a small, specialized metalworking shop where he could create custom pieces, intricate repairs, things of beauty and utility that demanded skill and artistry. He believed it was his purpose, his path to something more than just getting by. He'd bought the best machines he could afford, slowly, piece by piece, fixing them up himself, learning their every quirk. He'd envisioned a place where his hands, those same hands that now picked up stray bolts from a greasy factory floor, would shape metal into something meaningful, something his. That shop was supposed to be his legacy, the thing he could point to and say, "That was me." Now the thought of it sent a cold tremor through him. The memory of the for sale signs, the buyers haggling over his beloved equipment, the final, empty silence of the stripped-out space. It was a wound that refused to heal. He looked around the factory floor at the familiar faces, the men who had accepted their lot, their dreams perhaps long forgotten or never truly formed. He saw himself reflected in their tired eyes, but he also saw a chasm. He carried the ghost of Lester's custom fabrication inside him, a constant, flickering image of what might have been. It wasn't just the failure that haunted him. It was the feeling of having buried a piece of his very identity. He'd risked, and he'd lost. And that loss had instilled a deep-seated fear of ever risking again, a suffocating reluctance to take another big leap that might jeopardize the stability, however precarious, he'd managed to build for Martha and Sarah. The gap between the man he was reliable, steady, weary, and the man he'd dreamed of becoming, an independent craftsman, a creator. A man who left a tangible mark on the world, stretched wide and unforgiving, a silent scream in the quiet of his own mind. Every shift was a step further away from the dream, every clock out a quiet acknowledgement of its death. He yearned for something more, but the memory of the shop, now just a faded sign in his mind, was a constant reminder that sometimes trying for more just led to less. That internal scream had been building for months, a low, guttural rumble under the surface of his quiet life. He'd ignored it, pushed it down with sheer stubborn will, believing that if he just worked harder, sacrificed more, the market would turn, the right client would walk through the door, the dream would finally catch fire. But dreams, Lester was learning, needed more than just kindling. They needed fuel, and his reserves were running on empty, then on fumes, and finally on nothing at all. The crack didn't come with a bang, but a slow, agonizing splinter. It was a Tuesday, late autumn, the kind of day where the sky hung low and gray, mirroring the weight in his chest. He was sitting across from Mr. Henderson at the bank, a man whose smile had grown thinner with each passing month Lester's payments came up short. Martha had sent him alone, knowing he preferred to face these things himself to shield her from the blunt force of the inevitable. The papers were spread between them on the polished oak desk, figures he knew by heart, columns of red ink that bled into his vision. "Lester," Mr. Henderson began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "we've pushed it as far as we can. You're good for it, we know that, but the shop, it's a drain. The interest alone, you're digging a deeper hole, son." The words were an old song, but this time the melody was final. Lester didn't argue. He couldn't. He looked past Mr. Henderson out the window at the swirling leaves, each one a little death on the wind. He thought of the lathe, polished and powerful, waiting in his small shop. The welding rig, the cutting torches. Tools that felt like extensions of his own hands. He thought of the intricate gate he'd spent 100 hours designing, only to have the client pull out when their own business went south. He thought of the long nights, the dinners missed, the times Sarah had asked him to help with homework and he was too tired, too focused on the shop. He de-poured his soul, his sweat, every spare dime he'd ever earned into that small space, believing it was the engine that would finally lift them out of just getting by. He de-promised Martha. He de-promised himself. A cold dread seeped into his bones. His throat tightened. He picked up a pen, a heavy, corporate thing, and signed where Mr. Henderson pointed. Each stroke felt like a burial. A part of him died on that paper. Not just the business, but the independent craftsman, the man who believed he could build something bigger than himself. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of defeat, and walked out of the bank into the bleak afternoon, the gray sky now feeling like a permanent shroud over his future. The week that followed was a blur of phone calls, negotiations, and the gut-wrenching task of dismantling his dream. He sold off the plasma cutter first, the beast that had given his imagination free rein. Then the big lathe, then the smaller drill press, each piece a limb severed. The smell of metal dust, oil, and the lingering scent of his ambition slowly faded from the air of Lester's custom fabrication. The final buyer, a young guy with bright, eager eyes, took the last of the hand tools. He stood in the empty space, the echoes of his hope bouncing off the bare walls. He ran his hand over the worn concrete where his workbench used to be, feeling the ghosts of countless projects. Then he locked the door for the last time, the click of gunshot in the silence, and put the "For Rent" sign in the window. That night, 3 a.m. found Lester staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, Martha's steady breathing a soft counterpoint to the raging storm in his head. Sleep was a cruel joke. Every tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow against his skull, marking the relentless passage of time he felt he had squandered. The memory of the empty shop, the cold, vacant space, replayed behind his eyelids like a silent movie of his failure. He turned on his side, punching his pillow into submission. What had his life become? A factory worker, just like his father, just like his father's father. Steady, reliable, invisible. He'd spent years believing he was different, that he had a spark, a vision that would set him apart. He'd chased that spark with everything he had, and now it was gone, snuffed out by the grim realities of economic downturns and bad timing. He pulled himself up, sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning softly under his weight. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplified every creak of the old wood, every beat of his own frantic heart. He buried his face in his hands. Shame, thick and acrid, washed over him. He'd been so sure. So utterly convinced that Lester's custom fabrication was the answer, the legacy, the thing that would give meaning to his calloused hands and weary mind. He remembered Martha's quiet support, her faith in him, even when her eyes held a flicker of worry. He remembered telling Sarah years ago about his plan, seeing the admiration in her young face. Now what did he have to show for it? Debt, a hollowed-out dream, and a crushing sense of inadequacy. He was 48. 48 years old, and he felt like he was back at square one, only with more miles on the odometer and a heavier load of regret. He had sacrificed sleep, family dinners, precious weekends, all for a ghost. The factory job, once a stepping stone, now felt like a prison sentence, a stark reminder of the safety net he'd clung to even as he dreamed of flying. He had been so afraid of failure, but in trying to escape it, he had built a monument to it. He was lost, adrift in the wreckage of his own ambition, and the brutal honesty of the pre-dawn hours left him nowhere to hide. He was just Lester, the factory man, with nothing but a buried dream and an empty space where his purpose used to be. Lester stared at the brightening window, the first faint hint of dawn painting the eastern sky a bruised purple, seeping through the edges of the blackout curtains. He felt the cold seep into his bones despite the summer air, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside and everything to do with the emptiness inside him. His breath hitched, a small, ragged sound lost in the silence. He had chased a ghost, spent years pouring his lifeblood into something that in the end had just slipped through his fingers like sand. And for what? So he could sit here, alone in the quiet before the world woke, drowning in the bitter taste of, what if? If only, each memory of a late night spent toiling in the garage, each dollar saved and then sunk, each hopeful conversation with Martha now felt like a fresh wound. He had been so certain of his path, so convinced that his shop, Lester's custom fabrication, was the monument he was meant to build. Now it was just a memory, a canceled ledger, a pile of sold-off tools. He felt like a tree struck by lightning, its core hollowed out, leaving only a shell. The weight of it all, the crushing defeat, pressed down on him until he felt like he couldn't breathe. But as the first thin ray of sunlight pierced through a gap in the curtains, catching dust motes dancing in the stillness, a silent vow formed in the depths of his chest. It wasn't a shouted declaration, not a fit of anger or a sudden burst of inspiration. It was a whisper, barely audible even to himself, born of sheer, utter exhaustion. Enough. Enough of the guilt which had gnawed at him for months. Enough of the relentless regret which had kept him prisoner. Enough of letting that empty space in the garage and the even emptier space in his heart define him. The shop was gone. The dream, that specific dream of a successful business with his name above the door, was truly buried. And he couldn't bring it back. He couldn't resurrect it with wishing or lamenting. He couldn't keep carrying its weight like a stone in his pocket, dragging him down. It had to be let go. Not forgotten, perhaps, for it had been a significant chapter, but certainly released from its suffocating grip on his future. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't have a single answer for how to fill that profound void. He felt utterly clueless about what came next. But he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying in its uncertainty and liberating in its finality, that he couldn't keep looking backward. He couldn't stay lost in the wreckage of what was. He had to, somehow, find a way to step forward, even if it was into the dark. The next morning, the factory whistle shrilled its usual unwelcome greeting, ripping through the half-light of dawn. Lester went through the motions like a marionette, his body moving by rote memory. The familiar clang of metal, the rhythmic drone of machinery, the pervasive smell of hot grease and sweat, it was all there, the same as every other workday. But something was subtly different inside him. The dull, persistent ache in his chest was still there, a phantom limb of his lost dream, but beneath it, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor of something else stirred. A flicker of resolve, fragile as a moth's wing, but present nonetheless. He didn't race home that evening, didn't immediately disappear into his usual haze of television and quiet despair, the routine that had become his protective shell. Instead, as the sun dipped low, painting the clouds in bruised oranges and purples, casting long shadows across his small, neat yard, he found himself standing at the threshold of the garage, the space where Lester's custom fabrication had once lived and breathed. It was mostly empty now, echoing with the ghosts of machines and ambition. A few boxes of old, specialized tools he couldn't bring himself to sell sat tucked in a corner, alongside a workbench scarred with the history of countless projects and forgotten blueprints. Dust motes danced in the last, slanting slivers of light filtering through the grimy window. His gaze fell on a worn leather apron, hanging from a hook on the wall, the same one he'd worn in the shop, now stiff with disuse. He reached for it, his fingers tracing the faint oil stains, the tiny nicks where sparks had landed. He remembered the feeling of precision in his hands, the satisfying weight of a perfectly balanced wrench, the way metal yielded under his careful guidance, bending to his will. It wasn't about the shop, he realized with a quiet jolt that resonated deep in his bones. It wasn't about the business, the ledgers, the invoices, the struggle to turn a profit. It was about the doing. The act of taking raw material and shaping it, of solving a problem with ingenuity and skill. That was the core of it, the true heart of his passion. He hesitated, his hand still on the rough leather. The urge to just shut the door, to retreat to the familiar, numb comfort of his armchair and the blare of the TV was strong, a heavy blanket of resignation tempting him. What was the point? Why open old wounds only to find them festering still? But that whispered word from the pre-dawn hours, enough echoed in his mind, sharp and clear. He had to start somewhere, anywhere. With a deep, cleansing breath that tasted faintly of dust and forgotten metal, he pulled the apron on, tying the worn strings behind his back. It felt strangely comforting, a familiar embrace. He didn't have a big plan. He didn't have a client to impress, no deadline to meet. He just had a desire to make something, anything. He began by rummaging through one of the boxes, unearthing a few scraps of mild steel, odds and ends, offcuts left over from the closing, too small to sell, too precious to discard. He dragged out a small hand grinder, one of the few pieces of equipment he'd kept, a reliable friend through countless projects. The familiar hum, a low, resonant growl, filled the quiet garage. Then came the faint shower of sparks, a brief, glittering constellation as metal met abrasive. It was just a small piece of steel, nothing important, no grand design in mind. He wasn't building a new business. He was just working. But for the first time in months, Lester felt his hands remember, felt the dormant muscles reawaken, felt a purpose, however small and tentative, return to his being. It was hard, battling the creeping tendrils of despair, the insidious voice that whispered, "This changes nothing. You're still just a factory man." But he kept going. He shaped the metal, slowly, deliberately, the rhythmic scrape and grind a balm to his agitated spirit. The first tiny seed of something new had finally broken ground, not in the fertile soil of grand ambition, but in the dusty, quiet wreckage of what he thought he'd irrevocably lost. He wasn't sure what it was or where it would lead, but for now it was enough. It was a start. The next morning, the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen was just a hum. The garage, however, felt like a judgment, Lester stood by the back door, coffee cooling in his mug, staring at the closed door. The initial high of making something, anything, had dissipated with the morning light. What was he doing out there? Fiddling with scraps. It felt like a grown man playing with toy soldiers after the war was over. The insidious voice returned, louder this time, snickering. You think this changes anything? You think a few sparks and a wonky bracket are going to pull you out of the hole you dug? He forced himself out there, the concrete floor cool beneath his worn work boots. The piece of mild steel he'd started yesterday lay on his bench, looking smaller, more pathetic in the unforgiving light of the single bare bulb. He picked up the grinder again, the weight of it familiar, but the enthusiasm was gone. He was moving through the motions, a factory man doing factory work, even in his own space. He tried to continue shaping the metal, but his hands felt clumsy, his focus fractured. He pressed too hard, then too little, the rhythm off. The sparks didn't feel like constellations anymore. They felt like tiny, angry accusations. Day 3 was worse. He almost didn't go. He lingered over his breakfast, watching the news channel he never truly listened to, the drone of statistics a dull comfort. Martha, bless her, simply poured him another cup of coffee, her eyes holding that familiar, unasked question. He felt the weight of her unspoken hopes, which only made him feel heavier. He finally dragged himself to the garage, but the air felt thick with resentment, his own resentment at himself. He picked up a piece, then put it down. He cleaned a tool, then put it away. He looked at the half-finished piece, a small, decorative hook he'd vaguely imagined, and he saw only the specter of all the unfinished projects from Lester's custom fabrication. Every piece of raw material felt like a potential debt, a failed promise. He slammed the garage door shut and went back inside, leaving the metal cold and untouched. He'd quit. Just for today, he told himself. But the bitter taste was the same as it had been when he'd sold off the last lathe. The next morning, a Saturday, the internal battle raged. His body craved rest, his mind craved oblivion. But something else was stirring, a stubbornness deep-seated and unyielding, a trait his father had called both his greatest strength and his greatest curse. He thought about the factory floor, the relentless, mindless repetition, the hours ticking by like an executioner's clock. And then he thought about yesterday, slamming the garage door, the feeling of defeat. That was worse. Far worse than any struggle with a piece of steel. He walked back into the garage, not with enthusiasm, but with a grim resolve. He wouldn't quit, not like that. He picked up the half-finished hook, his fingers tracing the uneven grind. It wasn't perfect. It was far from it. It was a testament to his wavering focus, his lingering doubts. He turned on the grinder again, the hum a defiant roar this time. He would finish this hook. Not because it was beautiful or useful or part of some grand plan, but because he'd started it. He worked slowly, deliberately, each scrape of the metal against the abrasive, a tiny act of rebellion against the voice that told him to give up. His shoulders ached, his wrists cramped, and the fine dust of ground metal settled on his clothes and his hair. But when the hook was finally done, crude as it was, he held it up. It wasn't a triumph. It was simply finished. And that, he realized, was enough. For today, the cycle continued for days, for weeks. There were mornings he'd wake up and just want to pull the covers over his head and disappear. There were evenings he'd sit in the garage, tools scattered, unable to summon the will to lift a finger, lost in a haze of regret. He made mistakes. He ruined a piece of tubing trying to bend it, twisting it into a useless knot of metal. He burned himself more than once, little stings that were sharp reminders of his own clumsiness, his own distracted mind. Each small failure, each moment of doubt, felt like a fresh wound, reopening the deep gash left by the failure of his shop. He'd walk away, muttering, convinced it was all pointless. But then, an hour later or the next morning, he'd find himself back there. Not because he wanted to, not because he saw a clear path, but because not going back felt like giving in completely. It felt like allowing that failure to define him, to consume him. His hands would pick up a tool, almost of their own accord. His eyes would fall on a piece of metal, and a flicker of an idea, however small, would spark. It was a quiet, relentless battle against his own inertia, his own fear. He wasn't building a business. He was simply existing, fighting for a tiny sliver of control, a fragile sense of purpose in a world that felt increasingly out of his hands. He was fighting to remember the man he thought he was, even if that man felt like a ghost. Then one afternoon, maybe it was the light hitting the dusty workbench just right. Or maybe it was just a day when the usual weight felt a hair lighter, Lester picked up a piece of scrap steel. He didn't have a project in mind, didn't have a customer waiting. He just started to work it. A few cuts, a little grinding, shaping it into something small, ornamental, like a twisted vine or a stylized leaf. He wasn't trying to prove anything, not even to himself. He was just moving his hands, letting the rhythm of the work quiet the noise in his head. When he was done, he held the cool metal in his palm. It wasn't perfect, wouldn't sell for a dime, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, the feeling wasn't regret, but a whisper of quiet satisfaction. Martha found him later, still holding the small metal leaf. She didn't say anything about the shop or the debt or the silence that had lived between them for months. She just looked at him, then at the piece in his hand, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "That's nice, Lester," she said, her voice soft. "It really is." That was it. No fanfare, no grand declaration. Just a wife seeing a flicker of the man she married, a man who found solace in making things. A few days later, the neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, knocked on Lester's garage door. His ancient push mower had conked out, the main drive shaft bent something awful. "Thought maybe, Lester, with all your tools, you used to fix things, didn't you?" Henderson asked, a hopeful rasp in his voice. Lester hesitated. The old familiar dread of failing, of taking on something and making it worse, tightened in his gut. But then he looked at the bent shaft, a familiar kind of problem, a challenge his hands knew. "Bring it over, Stan," he found himself saying. "Let's take a look." He spent an afternoon in the garage, focused, absorbed, using his specialized skills to straighten and reinforce the metal. When Henderson came back, the mower purred like new. "Lester, how much do I owe you?" The old man asked, digging for his wallet. Lester shook his head. "Just glad to help, Stan. Keep that wallet in your pocket." The gratitude in Henderson's eyes, the sheer relief, felt good, better than any money he'd made in years. This small act, this simple helping hand, was like a loose thread Lester's fingers snagged on. One day, a flyer appeared on the community center bulletin board, tucked among notices for bingo night and potlucks. Volunteers needed for adult and youth skills workshop, teach basic repairs, woodworking, metalcraft. He walked past it a dozen times, telling himself he wasn't qualified, that he was a failure. But that little metal leaf and the fixed lawnmower kept whispering. One Tuesday evening, fueled by Martha's quiet encouragement, he walked through the doors. His hands, usually so confident with a wrench, felt awkward, shoved deep in his pockets. He started small, just helping set up, lending an extra hand. But soon, he was showing folks how to sharpen a chisel, how to fix a leaky pipe, how to weld two pieces of metal without making a mess. The older folks came for practical repairs. The younger ones, restless and curious, came for something to do, something real to learn. Lester, the quiet, weary factory man, transformed in that workshop. His voice, once low and hesitant, gained a patient authority as he explained the arc of a weld or the torque of a bolt. His eyes, no longer lost in thought, now sparkled with the shared joy of discovery. He showed a kid with fidgety hands how to shape a small, rough bird out of sheet metal. And when the boy held up his creation, grinning, Lester felt a warmth spread through him that he hadn't known since his own shop was just a hopeful blueprint. He taught them not just how to fix things, but how to see the potential in brokenness, in raw material. He taught them patience, the satisfaction of a job done right. The community workshop, it grew, a vibrant hub of clanking metal and sawdust, of laughter and focused concentration. Lester, who'd once buried his dream, found that the very tools and skills he thought were lost were now multiplying, taking root in dozens of eager hands. He wasn't building a single shop. He was building a whole community of makers, of fixers. His face still carried the lines of a life hard-lived, but the underlying weariness had receded, replaced by a quiet strength and a deep, abiding contentment. He still punched the clock at the factory, but his evenings, his weekends, they hummed with a different kind of purpose. "I thought my dream was that shop, those machines," Lester would sometimes say, leaning against a workbench, watching a group of teenagers hammer away at a project. "When I had to close it down, it felt like burying a piece of myself, like burying my whole future, really. But turns out what I really loved wasn't owning the shop or the name on the sign. What I really loved was making things, showing folks how to make them, how to figure stuff out with their own hands. That buried dream just made room for something bigger. It wasn't about my shop anymore, it was about what I could do with what I knew, and that," he'd gesture around the bustling workshop, a small, knowing smile on his lips, "that's still going. Long after my hands stop working, these hands and the hands they teach, they'll keep going. And that's the truth of it, isn't it? Some dreams, they ain't meant to sit on a shelf or cast a shadow. Some dreams, they gotta go into the ground. Not to die, mind you, but to become the seed. To become the root that feeds a whole new forest, a whole new purpose, far bigger